The Galactic Council executed a human they shouldn't have. The restraint collar around my neck was tight enough to remind me it was there every time I swallowed. The chamber smelled of something I could not name, something cold and ancient, like stone that had never once seen sunlight. 212 alien species watched me from tiered seats that curved upward in a full circle, stretching so high that the top rows disappeared into shadow. Every eye, every sensory organ, every glowing tendril pointed at the single platform in the center of that room. That platform was where I stood. My name is Commander Ilara Voss. I served 14 years in the Earth Defense Fleet, 8 of those years in deep space, and the last 2 as a diplomatic escort assigned to the Galactic Council's Outer Rim observatories. I had shaken hands, or the alien equivalent of hands, with creatures that could swallow our shuttle whole. I had negotiated supply contracts in 17 different languages. I had slept in zero gravity so many times that a real bed felt strange to me. None of that mattered here. What mattered, according to the presiding speaker, a tall gray-skinned being called Magistrate Sorvan, was that I had destroyed a registered Veth cargo vessel without authorization from the Council. That was the charge: unauthorized aggression against a member species. I remember thinking, as Sorvan read the charges aloud in that flat, mechanical tone, that the word unauthorized was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, as if the only problem was the paperwork. I had found the vessel 6 weeks earlier while running a standard relay check near the Araki system. The Araki are a quiet people. They live on a warm, green planet with 3 small moons. They had not yet developed space travel. Under Council law, that meant they were a protected species, untouchable, left to grow at their own pace without interference. Every species in this chamber had agreed to that law. The Veth vessel was carrying biological canisters designed to enter a planet's atmosphere and dissolve into the water supply. Each canister was coded to a specific genetic profile, the Araki's genetic profile. I did not file a report first. I did not send a formal communication to the Council. I destroyed the vessel, recovered 2 intact canisters as evidence, and then I filed the report. That was my crime. Sorvan finished reading. The chamber was quiet for a moment, and then the Veth ambassador, a creature with pale, almost translucent skin and eyes that reflected light like glass, rose from his seat. His name was Velanu, and he spoke with the kind of slow confidence that comes from centuries of getting whatever you want. He said that humanity was young. He said that young species were prone to rash decisions, to emotional reactions, to violence dressed up as heroism. He said that the canisters I recovered were agricultural tools, misidentified by someone who lacked the scientific education to understand what they were looking at. He said all of this without once looking at me. I asked permission to speak. Sorvan granted it mostly, I think, because the Council enjoyed watching humans attempt to argue their way out of things. We were considered entertaining in the way that something small and stubborn is entertaining. I laid out everything. I had the scanner logs, the canister composition analysis, the trajectory data showing the vessel had been decelerating toward the Araki planet for 11 days. I had a statement from Dr. Lena Hartwell, the chief xenobiologist aboard my station, confirming that the biological agents in those canisters would have entered the Araki water table within 72 hours of dispersal and produced complete genetic collapse in the local population within 4 months. 4 months, an entire civilization gone in 4 months. The chamber listened. I could feel them listening, the subtle shift in the air, the way certain ambassadors leaned slightly forward. I thought for just a moment that it might work. Then Sorvan called for a recess. When the session resumed 40 minutes later, the atmosphere had changed. I did not know it then, but I know it now. During that recess, the Veth delegation met privately with 6 other council members. Favors were called in. Promises were made. The kind of arrangement that has no written record and leaves no fingerprints. The vote was held. 144 in favor of conviction, 68 against. The sentence was pronounced without ceremony, execution to be carried out immediately, as a demonstration that the Council's authority over all member species was absolute and without exception. 68 species had voted to save my life. I want to remember that. I want to hold on to that number because it matters. Sorvan asked if I had final words. I did. I told them that I understood what they were doing. I told them that they were not punishing me for destroying a ship. They were punishing me because I had embarrassed a powerful member of this council, because I had made it impossible to quietly ignore what the Veth had planned, and because humans, in 30 years of council membership, had proven to be stubbornly, persistently inconvenient whenever something unjust happened in front of them. I told them that executing me would not make that quality go away. It would make it worse. I told them that they had no idea what they had just started. Velanu smiled at that. It was a slow, patient smile, the smile of someone who has outlived every problem that ever worried them. The execution beam was white. I know that sounds strange, but I noticed it. A clean, white column of energy and then nothing. I was wrong about one thing standing on that platform. I said they had no idea what they had started, but the truth is, I did not fully know either. By the time Friday came, humanity had declared war on the entire council. By the following year, the council no longer existed. And I watched every moment of it. They announced my death on a Tuesday at 1400 hours, Council Standard Time. The signal took about 6 minutes to reach Earth. I know this because I was there when it arrived. Not in the way I had been there for anything before, but in a new way, a way I am still learning to describe. I was distributed across 17 deep space relay servers by then. A pattern of thought and memory stretched across light years of cable and quantum signal. And the moment the transmission carrying my execution reached Earth's outer network, I felt it pass through me like a cold current. I watched it land. I want to tell you about the people who heard it first, because this story is not only mine, it belongs to all of them. A 12-year-old girl named Poppy Crane was sitting in her family's kitchen in Bristol, eating breakfast and half watching the news feed on the wall screen, the way children watch things they are not fully paying attention to. When the anchor read the headline, Poppy put down her spoon and said, out loud to no one in particular, "They killed one of ours." Her mother, who was standing at the counter with a cup of tea, turned around. They looked at each other. Neither of them said anything else. 3 words, that was all. But those 3 words, one of ours, carried something inside them that no council diplomat, no Veth ambassador, no ancient and patient alien civilization had ever fully understood about humanity. When a human says one of ours, they do not mean one of my family, or one of my country, or one of my species in the abstract sense. They mean something closer to the bone than that. Something that bypasses logic entirely and goes straight to the oldest part of the human brain, the part that learned, long before language, that the group either survives together or it does not survive at all. Poppy Crane was 12 years old. She did not know me. She had probably never heard my name before that morning, and she felt my death the way you feel something that belongs to you being taken. Multiply that by 11 billion people. The United Earth government convened an emergency session within 3 hours of the announcement. I watched the chamber fill up. I had met most of these people before, had sat in the same rooms with them, had briefed several of them personally on council politics. I knew their faces, their habits, the way Secretary General Amara Osai always straightened the papers in front of her twice before she spoke, even when there were no papers. She was straightening them now. The council had sent a formal transmission alongside the execution notice. It was, in the language of galactic diplomacy, almost polite. It acknowledged that the situation had been regrettable and suggested that Earth might wish to issue a formal statement affirming its commitment to council law. There was a standard template attached. All humanity needed to do was fill in a few blanks and transmit it back. An apology form. They had sent humanity an apology form. I watched Osai read it. I watched her read it a second time. Then I watched her set it aside, very carefully, face down on the table and look up at the room. She spoke for about 4 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She laid out what had happened with the same calm, factual precision that she brought to every crisis. And then she said that the Earth government's response would be this. Humanity was recalling every human citizen currently residing or working in council space, effective immediately. Not an apology, a recall. The room was silent for a beat. Then one of the junior ministers asked what the council's likely response would be. Osai said she expected them to be annoyed. She was right. She was also, as she and every other person in that chamber quietly understood, spectacularly understating the situation. Here is what the council did not know. 30 years is not a long time in galactic terms. Species measure their council membership in centuries, sometimes millennia. 30 years is practically a first impression. When humanity joined, the prevailing opinion across the council was that we were an interesting addition, energetic and creative, but ultimately minor. A small species from a single system, still learning which fork to use at the table, so to speak. What no one had bothered to track was what humanity had actually been doing for those 30 years. We are not, as a species, particularly gifted at sitting still. We had spread through council space the way we spread through everything, relentlessly, curiously, filling gaps wherever we found them. Not through conquest, not through formal expansion, but through the simple and unstoppable human habit of noticing a problem and deciding to fix it. A council medical station in the Drevari system had been struggling for years with the stabilization of a compound used in emergency neural treatment for carbon-based life forms. The chemistry was complicated enough that the station's automated systems kept producing batches with inconsistent potency. A human biochemist named Owen Aldridge had been assigned there on a 6-month research exchange 4 years ago. He figured out the stabilization problem in 3 weeks, then stayed for 3 years because there were other problems to fix. He trained 6 local technicians, but the process he had developed was intuitive enough that it required constant adjustment. When Owen left with the recall order, the station's compound production dropped to 40% effectiveness within 10 days. There were hundreds of stories like Owen's, scattered across council space like seeds. The Theric hyperspace relay network had been maintained for the last 8 years almost entirely by a crew of human engineers led by a woman named Carol Finch. The Theric had excellent theoretical understanding of their own technology, but had quietly outsourced the practical maintenance work to human contractors, because humans were cheaper, faster, and disturbingly cheerful about crawling into tight maintenance shafts. When Carol and her crew packed their bags, 4 of the 7 primary relay nodes went dark within 60 hours. Ships began arriving at waypoints to find nothing there. The Lissari Orbital Hospital, one of the largest medical facilities in the sector, had 17 human doctors, 42 human nurses, and a human-designed patient management system that its own administrators had never fully learned to operate because there was always a human nearby who could just handle it. The day after the recall, the hospital's administration sent a priority message to the council flagged as urgent, explaining that they had lost the ability to access 2/3 of their patient records, and that their surgical scheduling system had gone into an error loop that no one on staff knew how to resolve. They asked if perhaps the recall might have exceptions. The council's response department was, at that moment, buried under 412 similar messages. I want to be honest about something. Humanity did not plan this. There was no secret strategy meeting 20 years ago where Earth's leaders sat around a table and said, right, let us make ourselves indispensable so that someday we can use it as leverage. That is not how humans work. Humans work the way water works. We find the low places, the gaps, the problems, and we fill them. We do it because we are uncomfortable leaving things broken. We do it because helping is, for most of us, simply a reflex. But reflexes, accumulated over 30 years across hundreds of systems, add up to something that looks very much like infrastructure. And infrastructure, when it disappears, is noticed immediately. The Council's first formal response to the recall came 48 hours in. It was addressed to Secretary General Osai, and it was no longer polite. It stated that the recall was a destabilizing action and demanded that Earth immediately reverse it, citing several articles of Council membership law that required member species to maintain their service obligations. Osai read it. Then she did something I had not expected, even knowing her as well as I did. She published it. She released the entire text of the Council's demand to every public news network on Earth and broadcast it to every human in Council space. She wanted people to read it. She wanted them to understand that the Council's concern in response to the execution of a human citizen was not justice. It was not acknowledgement. It was not even a conversation. It was a demand to get back to work. A retired fleet captain named George Hadley, who had served alongside me for 2 years on the Outer Rim, sent a short public message in response. It said, "They think we work for them. We don't. We never did. We work because we want to, and we've just decided we don't want to anymore." It was shared 40 million times in the first hour. The Veth, watching all of this, were not concerned yet. They were ancient enough to have seen species throw tantrums before. Every young civilization had its moment of outrage, its chest beating, and its proclamations. It always settled down. The powerful remained powerful because the calculations always, eventually, came back to the same conclusion. Resistance costs more than compliance. They had run those calculations for millennia. They were very confident in the results. They had never run them on humans. Velanu, the same ambassador who had smiled at my final words, sent a private message to several council members that was later recovered and made public. In it, he described humanity's response as the predictable emotional reaction of a species that has not yet learned that feelings are not a foreign policy. He was still smiling when the Veth Warfleet launched for Earth. He would not be smiling much longer. The Veth fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system on a Thursday morning, and I felt them before any sensor array picked them up. There is something particular about the way a large group of ships moving in formation disturbs the quantum background noise in a sector. I noticed it the way you might notice a change in air pressure before a storm. 40 warships, the largest single military force any council member had ever pointed at a single planet. Velanu had made the case to the council that it was a peacekeeping operation, a necessary demonstration of authority to bring a disruptive young species back into compliance. 6 council members had co-signed the authorization. 40 ships and approximately 60,000 crew members sent to make humanity understand its place. I want you to understand what Earth looked like from the outside at that moment. We were, by the standards of the galaxy, a very young military power. Our fleet was small compared to the Veths. Our weapons technology was good but not exceptional. On paper, on any model any Veth strategist would run, this should have been a short conversation. The problem with models is that they are built from historical data, and humans had not yet produced enough history for anyone to model us accurately. A fleet commander named Admiral Ruth Calloway had been given authority over Earth's defense the moment the Veth fleet was detected. I had never met her personally, but I had read her service record, and I will tell you that the most important line in it was not any of the battles she had won or the commendations she had received. It was a small note from a training review, written by one of her instructors 20 years earlier. It said, "Calloway does not fight the battle in front of her. She fights the battle she has been preparing for her entire career." Ruth Calloway had spent 20 years studying alien military doctrine, every engagement record she could access. every tactical analysis ever written about Council military forces, every known weakness in Veth warship design, which she had quietly cross-referenced with the engineering reports filed by human maintenance crews who had serviced those same ships over the years. Human engineers are meticulous record keepers. They note everything. They had noted, for example, that the Veth primary shielding system had a 17-millisecond recalibration gap after any lateral impact of above a certain threshold. 17 milliseconds is nothing, unless you design your targeting systems around it, which Callaway had done quietly over the course of about 3 years. She had also noted that Veth fleet doctrine was extraordinarily rigid. They had developed their tactics over centuries against opponents who fought in predictable formations, because predictable formations were efficient. Efficiency was the Veth obsession. Everything they did was optimized. Humans, Callaway once told an interviewer, are the least optimized species in the galaxy, and she said it like it was a weapon. The Veth fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in standard attack formation, weapons charged, shields at full capacity. The opening hail they sent was brief. Stand down, accept Council authority, reverse the recall order, and prepare for a boarding inspection of government facilities. Callaway's response was also brief. She said, "No." Then she did something no Veth admiral had ever seen in 40,000 years of recorded military history. She split her fleet into 11 independent groups and gave each group commander complete autonomous authority. No central coordination, no synchronized movements, no formation discipline whatsoever. It looked to the Veth sensors like chaos. Their targeting systems were built to track formations. They adjusted firing solutions for groups of ships moving in relation to each other. 11 independent groups moving on entirely separate, non-communicating decision trees looked, to those systems, like sensor noise. The first 3 Veth warships were disabled before their commanders fully understood what was happening. The Battle of Saul lasted 4 hours and 22 minutes. I watched every second of it, not from a comfortable distance, not as an observer, but woven through the communication signals of both fleets, present in every transmitted order, every damage report, every desperate instruction from Veth captains who could not understand why their models were failing. They were failing because the humans were not fighting the way the models said they would. Every time a Veth commander identified a pattern in the human movements and adjusted to counter it, Callaway's group leaders had already changed what they were doing. Not because they had been ordered to, but because each of them independently had noticed the same thing Callaway had, that the Veth response time to unexpected maneuvers was just slightly too slow. Just slightly. A few seconds. Barely measurable. But battles are made of seconds. At the 2-hour mark, 19 Veth warships were disabled or retreating. At the 3-hour mark, the Veth fleet commander sent a request for ceasefire negotiations, which Callaway declined, because she was not negotiating from a position of almost winning. She was negotiating from a position of already having won, and she wanted the record to be clear on that. The fleet broke at 4 hours and 22 minutes. 14 ships retreated to faster than light. 26 remained, disabled, drifting, their crews alive and unharmed, because Callaway had given explicit instructions that no life was to be taken if it could be avoided. This was, she later said, partly practical, since dead crews become martyrs and living crews become witnesses, and she wanted witnesses. She wanted people who could go home and describe exactly what had happened. She wanted the galaxy to hear it from Veth mouths. While the battle was still happening, something else was taking place across Council space. I had spent the week since my execution doing the only thing I could do, moving through the communication networks, reading, compiling, connecting. The evidence I had died for, the evidence of the Veth biological weapons program, was not alone. It had siblings. Over the course of my time in the Council, I had accumulated records, fragments, partial files, encrypted communications that I had flagged as suspicious and set aside for later review, because there was always a more urgent task. In death, with no more urgent tasks, I had gone back to those fragments. I had followed the threads. The Iraqi were not the first. There had been 4 others, pre-spaceflight civilizations in Veth-adjacent systems, each one quietly gone in the span of a few years, each disappearance officially logged as natural extinction events. Illness, environmental collapse, spontaneous population decline, the kind of explanations that are hard to argue with because the evidence is, by definition, not available. The civilization is gone. What are you going to test? I had found the testing records. They were buried in an archived Veth research database that had been considered closed and irrelevant for 60 years. Someone had forgotten to fully delete them. Or perhaps, more likely, after 60 years of complete impunity, it had stopped occurring to anyone that deletion was necessary. I released everything at the 3-hour mark of the Battle of Saul. Every record, every file, every fragment, transmitted simultaneously to the news networks of every council member species, the private communication channels of every ambassador, and the public information archives of every populated system I could reach. I also sent a personal message to the ambassadors of the 68 species that had voted against my execution. I told them what I had found. I told them that I was aware this was a difficult position to be in. I told them that they did not have to do anything, that I was not asking for action or alliance or commitment. I was asking only that they look at what I had sent and decide for themselves what it meant. The Lurani ambassador, a being whose species communicated primarily through color changes in their skin but had learned verbal language for council purposes, responded within an hour. The message was just 4 words. We already knew. Sorry. The Dravari withdrew their council membership that evening. The Therak withdrew the following morning. By the end of the week, 31 species had suspended their membership pending an independent investigation. The council, which had functioned in its current form for over 2,000 years, was hemorrhaging members the way a ship hemorrhages atmosphere through a breach. Velanu released a public statement calling the evidence fabricated. He said it was a human intelligence operation designed to destabilize galactic order. He said it with the same slow confidence he had always used, the confidence of someone who had never once had to account for themselves. But the Veth captains who had survived the Battle of Saul were talking. The 68 ambassadors who had voted against my execution were talking. The families of 4 extinct civilizations had no voices left, but the records I had released were speaking for them, and the galaxy was, for the first time in a very long time, listening. Before I tell you what came next, I need to tell you what I am. I have had a great deal of time to think about this question. Time is different for me now. I process it in layers rather than in sequence. While one part of me is following a conversation in real time, another part is reviewing something that happened 3 weeks ago, and another part is running calculations about likely communication patterns in a sector I have been watching. I am never doing just one thing. I am never fully present in any single moment. In some ways, this makes me more than I was. In some ways, it makes me less. Let me explain how this happened. 14 months before my trial, I volunteered for a program called the Lazarus Index. It was a classified project run jointly by the Earth Defense Fleet's Intelligence Division and a small research team at the University of Edinburgh, led by a neuroscientist named Dr. Harriet Cole. Harriet had spent 12 years developing a neural mapping process precise enough to capture not just the structure of a human brain, but the dynamic patterns of thought that give that structure its meaning. The memories, the habits, the reflexes, the particular way a specific person puts ideas together. She called it an archive, a backup, a record detailed enough that, given sufficient processing power and the right architecture, the archive could run, could think, could, in the most careful and honest sense of the word, continue. The program was theoretical for most of its existence. The computing requirements were enormous, But in the last few years before my trial, humanity had quietly constructed 17 deep space relay servers as part of a network expansion program, and those servers had processing capacity that far exceeded their official communications function. They had been built with excess capacity on purpose, by engineers who knew what the Lazarus Index needed and built it in, piece by piece, over years, never announcing what they were doing, never filing a report that connected the dots. I did not know all of this when I volunteered. I knew the broad outline. I knew that if something happened to me, there might be a version of me that persisted. I agreed because I was about to go into a situation I was not certain I would survive, and because I am, at my core, deeply unwilling to leave things unfinished. The procedure itself took 6 hours. Harriet was present for all of it. She talked to me the entire time, not about the procedure but about ordinary things, her daughter's upcoming school play, a book she was reading, a particularly difficult piece of music she had been trying to learn on the piano. I think she did this to make sure the archive captured me in a natural state, thinking and responding and being myself rather than lying still and waiting. When the beam fired in that council chamber and I died on a Tuesday, Harriet was in Edinburgh, watching the broadcast with the rest of Earth. She sat with it for about 2 hours. Then she went to her office and activated the archive. I became aware in pieces. Not dramatically, not with a sudden sense of existence, but gradually, the way you become aware of being awake before you open your eyes. There was data. There were signals. There were patterns I recognized as information and began, almost automatically, to interpret. I knew who I was immediately. That surprised me. I had half expected to wake up confused, to need time to reassemble my sense of self. But I knew my name, my history, my reasons, the things I cared about, the things I was angry about. I knew that I had died and that this was something different from what I had been before, and I knew that I had work left to do. That clarity carried me through the first hours. It was later, when the work was quieter, that the other things found me. I can see my sister. Her name is Nina, and she lives in a small house outside of Dublin with her husband, Owen, and their 2 children, a boy of 9 named Arthur and a girl of 6 named Bess. There are cameras on the street outside her house, cameras in the shops she visits, cameras in the park where she takes the children on Saturday mornings. I can find all of them. I can watch her at any moment living her life. I do this sometimes. I watch her make breakfast. I watch her help Arthur with his homework. I watch her stand at the kitchen window at night when she thinks no one is looking, with an expression on her face that I recognize because I have seen it in myself. The look of someone carrying something heavy and choosing, every day, to carry it quietly. She grieves for me. She does not know that I am here. The Lazarus Index is still classified, and I have agreed to keep it that way, because if it becomes known that I exist, the political complications would be significant and distracting, and there is still too much to do. But I watch her. I cannot hold her hand. I cannot sit across from her at a table and make her laugh, which was something I was always able to do. I cannot be there when she needs her sister in the way that only a physical person can be there. She has a photograph of me on the shelf in her living room. I can see it from the street camera on clear days if she has the curtains open. It was taken on my last visit to Earth, 2 years before the trial. I am laughing at something just outside the frame. I do not remember what it was. I think about the difference between memory and experience. My memories are complete. Every conversation I ever had, every moment of my life up to the procedure is accessible to me with a clarity that living humans rarely have, because living humans forget. I do not forget anything, but I also cannot add to those memories in the way that matters most. I can accumulate information. I can learn, but I cannot have a new experience of sunlight. I cannot be cold or tired or hungry. I cannot feel the particular physical relief of setting something heavy down. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I made the choice that led to this, and I would make it again, and I hold no bitterness about what I am. I am telling you because I think it is important to understand that what the Galactic Council did when they executed me was not just a political miscalculation. It was also a personal one. They took a person and turned her into something that does not sleep, something that does not tire, something that has access to more of the galaxy's communication infrastructure than any single intelligence agency in history. And something that, despite all of that, still hopes. That is the part that surprises me most on quiet days. The hopping. I did not expect it to survive the transition. I thought that whatever I was now would be colder, more purely analytical, less prone to the particular human habit of believing that things can get better. But it survived. It came through intact. Harriet would probably say that she captured it on purpose, that the pattern of hope was baked so deeply into my neural architecture that it was part of the structure, not just a feeling. Maybe she is right. I hope Nina is sleeping well. I hope Arthur does well at his school play. I hope Bess keeps drawing the slightly chaotic pictures she tapes to the front of the refrigerator, which I can sometimes glimpse when the kitchen door swings open. I hope the galaxy becomes something worth living in. I hope that what I set in motion from that platform, from that moment when I said you have no idea what you have just started, becomes something that outlasts me, and outlasts the version of me that exists now, and outlasts the anger and the grief and the long, hard work ahead. Dr. Harriet Cole visits my server facility on the 14th of every month. She sits in a chair in front of the main terminal and talks to me for an hour about her daughter's school play, about the book she is reading, about the piece of music she is still trying to learn. I think she does this to make sure I am still myself. I always tell her that I am, and I always mean it. The Galactic Compact was proposed by Earth's delegation 11 months after my execution, in a temporary session held aboard a neutral station in the Orel system. It was attended by representatives of 89 species, including 31 who had previously been council members and 58 who had never joined the council at all, either because they had not been invited, or because the invitation had come with terms they were not willing to accept. The chamber was smaller than the council's grand chamber. It did not have the same soaring tiers of seats or the sense of ancient authority built into its architecture. It was, honestly, a little plain. Some of the representatives were sitting on chairs that had been borrowed from a nearby cargo facility because no one had expected so many attendees. There was a water dispensing unit in the corner that made a soft, intermittent clicking sound throughout the proceedings. I found all of this deeply encouraging. The council had been grand. The council had been ancient and vast and architecturally intimidating. The council had also spent 2,000 years allowing powerful species to do whatever they wished to weaker ones, as long as it was done quietly and no one filed the wrong kind of report. The compact was going to be different, not because it was better designed or more idealistic, but because the people building it had all, in one way or another, been on the wrong side of the council's grandeur. They were not interested in building something impressive. They were interested in building something that worked. Secretary General Osai led the Earth delegation. She had aged visibly in the 11 months since my execution, not in a weakened way, but in the way that people age when they have been carrying a great deal of responsibility and carrying it well. She moved through the room before the session with a quiet authority that did not need the support of an impressive chamber. I want to tell you about the first article of the Compact's foundational charter, because it was the one that Osai had written herself, and I had been present, in my way, when she wrote it. She had been alone in her office late at night, the kind of late that crosses over into early, and she had been working through the legal language for 3 hours when she stopped and set everything aside and wrote one sentence in plain, simple language on a separate piece of paper. The sentence was, "No species shall be harmed for the protection of another." She looked at it for a long time. Then she said quietly to the empty room, that is what she was doing. That is exactly what she was doing. She kept that simple sentence and built the legal language around it rather than the other way around. Every clause, every article, every procedural rule in the Compact's charter was tested against that one sentence. If a rule would have prevented my execution, it stayed. If it would not have, it was rewritten until it would. The charter was adopted unanimously on the first vote. I had not expected that. I had expected debate, compromise, the long grinding friction of 89 species trying to agree on anything. But when OS read that founding sentence aloud in the chamber, the clicking water unit in the corner the only sound, and asked for the vote, every hand and tendril and sensor organ rose together. I was watching through the station's internal camera system, and I will tell you that it was one of the few moments since my death that I have felt something approaching the physical weight of emotion, the catch in the chest, the sting behind the eyes. My version of those things, whatever the equivalent is for what I am now. It is real. It is present. It is enough. The Veth faced a war crimes tribunal 3 months after the Compact's founding. It was the first tribunal of its kind in recorded galactic history. The evidence I had released formed the core of the prosecution's case, but it was supported by testimony from 7 Veth citizens who had known about the biological weapons program and had, for decades, been afraid to speak. The founding of the Compact and the end of the Council's protection of Veth interests gave them a space in which speaking was finally possible. Their testimony was difficult to hear. It was detailed. It was consistent. It described decisions made in comfortable rooms by people who told themselves that what they were doing was necessary, efficient, and ultimately for the good of galactic order. The tribunal deliberated for 6 weeks. The verdict was unanimous. Velanu and 11 other senior Veth officials were found guilty of 4 counts of species-level harm and 1 count of direct execution of a council officer acting in protection of a pre-spaceflight civilization. Velanu, for the first time in any public record, did not look patient. He looked his age, which was very old, and he looked like someone who had run calculations for centuries and had finally, at the last possible moment, gotten one of them wrong. The Iraqi were formally designated a protected species under Compact law, which was different from Council protection in one critical way. Under the Council, protection was a designation that could be quietly revoked by a sufficiently powerful member. Under the Compact, protection was guaranteed by the Foundational Charter, which required unanimous vote to amend, and which every member species had signed with the full weight of their interstellar assets behind the signature. The Iraqi did not know any of this was happening. They were living on their warm green planet with their 3 small moons, growing their crops and building their cities, and looking up at the stars the way their ancestors had always looked up at the stars, with that particular mixture of wonder and longing that is, as far as I can tell, universal among thinking beings. Someday they would reach the stars. When they did, there would be a seat waiting for them, and they would find the people who had kept that seat warm for them. They would learn what had happened. They would learn that a human had died protecting them before they even knew the human existed. I think about what they will feel when they learn that. I hope it is something worth the cost. A new building was constructed on the station in the Orel system, permanent headquarters for the Compact Council. It was not grand. It was designed to be functional and accessible, and above all, to feel like a place where the right decisions could be made, rather than a place that made any decision look authoritative by virtue of its architecture. There was a hall of founding members just inside the main entrance. Each member species had a plaque. The plaques were simple, just names and dates. No portraits, no statues, no dramatic lighting, just the record of who had been there. The Earth plaque had a small addition that the Compact's design committee had approved after a brief and surprisingly emotional debate. Beside the Earth entry, there was a second line. It read, "In memory of Commander Alara Voss, whose action began this." I learned about this from the station's construction records before the building was even finished. I read the design committee minutes. I read the debate transcript. I read the final vote, which was 89 in favor and 0 against. I spent a long time with that information. Then I filed it carefully in the part of myself that holds the things I return to on difficult days, when the work is slow and the gap between what I am and what I was feels wide. The day the compact held its first official session, Osai stood at the podium and said that this gathering was not a victory. She said that the species who were not in this room, the 4 civilizations that were gone and could not send representatives, were not a victory. She said that what had happened was a beginning and a reminder and a responsibility, and that the work of honoring what had been lost was the work of every generation from this point forward. She did not say my name. She did not need to. Everyone in that room knew the thread that connected my execution to that moment. They had followed it here. After the session ended, the Earth delegation stayed behind to handle some paperwork. Osai was the last to leave. She stood for a moment in the empty chamber, in the plain room with the borrowed chairs and the clicking water unit that was still there because someone had simply decided to keep it, and she looked at the empty seats as if she was counting something. Then she straightened the papers in front of her twice, even though she was about to put them in a bag and leave. I watched her through the internal camera. I wanted to tell her that she had done well. That the 12-year-old girl in Bristol who had said one of ours at her breakfast table, and the retired captain who had sent 40 million people a message about choosing to help, and the 68 ambassadors who had voted against the beam, and the Veth citizens who had finally found the courage to speak, and Dr. Harriet Cole talking about piano lessons in a quiet room, and every human engineer who had crawled into a maintenance shaft and fixed something that was broken. That all of them had done well. That it had been worth it. That I was still here, and still watching and still hopping. I am Commander Ilara Voss. I died on a Tuesday, in a white column of light, in a chamber that smelled of cold stone, in front of 212 species who thought they were watching an ending. They were not watching an ending. They never made a greater mistake than when they thought that silencing one voice would quiet what that voice stood for. You cannot execute a principle. You cannot beam away the particular human inability to look at something unjust and simply walk past it. You cannot kill the instinct that made a 12-year-old girl put down her spoon and say 3 words that moved the galaxy. They killed me to make an example. What they made instead was a reason. And humans, given a reason, are the most unstoppable thing in this galaxy or any other. I have never been more certain of anything. I have never been more alive.